Tonight, we walk backward into a story that was never meant to be told from the centre, but from the edges, where silence gathers and meaning fractures. There was a woman once, or something like a woman, whose name became a warning long before it was remembered as a life. But before her, there were older things, forces that did not see, did not judge, did not forgive. And perhaps they never stopped watching. Before she had a face that turned the living into stone, she existed only as a possibility within a world that did not yet know softness. The early universe of the Greeks was not kind. It did not grow gently into form, but emerged from rupture, an opening, a tearing, a widening silence that called itself chaos. There was no sky to look up to, no ground to stand upon, only the slow assembling of presence. From this absence came the first shapes: earth, deep and unmoving; night, endless and indifferent; sea, restless and without memory. Nothing in these early moments resembled what would later be called justice. Power did not ask permission. It expanded, collided, consumed. The earliest beings did not speak or think as humans would imagine. They were their nature, inseparable from it. To exist was to act, and to act was to reshape everything around them. There were no stories yet, only consequences. In such a world, what would it mean to be seen? To be noticed was not a blessing. It was exposure, a drawing of attention that often ended in transformation or erasure. Much later, when the gods took form and gave names to the forces that preceded them, they did not soften this truth. They inherited it. Beneath their beauty and voices, they remained bound to something older, colder. Their desires carried weight not because they were right, but because they could not be resisted. And somewhere, far from the centre of these rising powers, a life would begin that was never meant to endure their gaze. Not as it was. The story of Medusa does not begin with her. It begins with a world that had already decided what happens to those who are seen, and what happens to those who are not protected. The silence of that decision lingers still. There was a time when even silence had not yet learned its own weight, not the quiet that follows sound, nor the stillness that comes before a storm, but something deeper. A vast, unmoving presence that did not wait, did not listen, did not hold memory. It did not stretch across space, because space had not yet been imagined. It did not flow through time, because time had not begun its slow unravelling. This was what would later be called chaos. But the word is misleading. It suggests disorder, a kind of restless confusion. What existed then was something far colder. Not disorder, absence of distinction. Nothing separated from anything else because there were no edges to separate. No above or below, no before or after. Only a continuous, unbroken existence that did not yet know itself. And yet, within that endless stillness, something stirred. Not with purpose, not with intent, but with inevitability. Like pressure building in a place without walls, forms began to emerge, not created, but revealed. The first of these was Gaia. Not earth as soil or mountain, but as presence, weight, foundation, a surface that could hold. She did not rise from chaos as a daughter rises from a mother. She simply was, suddenly distinguishable where nothing had been distinct before. With her came the first suggestion of division. Above and below, holding and being held, stillness and the potential for movement. Then, from a depth that seemed to open within the fabric of existence itself, came Tartarus, a descent without end. Not a place one could fall into, but the idea of falling made real, a hollowing of reality, a direction where none had existed, and between these forces something more subtle appeared, Eros. Not love as warmth or longing, but as attraction, the unseen thread that draws things together. A binding force, a quiet insistence that what exists will not remain apart. It did not ask permission. It did not choose, it simply pulled. And so, the first relationships formed, not relationships of care, but of consequence. Gaia began to change. From within her, new forms pressed outward, children not born through gentleness, but through necessity. Mountains rose not as beauty, but as tension made visible. The sea gathered, restless and shifting, unable to remain still upon her surface. And then came Uranus, the sky. He did not hover above Gaia in distance. He wrapped around her, pressed against her, enclosing her. There was no space between them, no breath, no separation. Their union was not a meeting, it was a containment. From this closeness, more beings emerged. The Titans. They were vast, ancient, and without softness. They did not question their existence, they did not reflect upon it. They simply were, extensions of the forces that shaped them. Time had not yet given them perspective, and so they did not hesitate. Their presence was immediate, absolute. And yet, even here, something began to fracture. Because Uranus, who covered Gaia completely, began to fear what was born from her. His children were not small. They were not controllable. They carried within them the same force that had allowed him to exist. And in that recognition, something like resistance emerged, not thought, not emotion, but reaction. He began to push them back, to force them inward, to deny them space. Gaia, who had become the ground of all things, felt this pressure, not as pain, but as imbalance, a tension that could not remain unresolved. Within her something gathered, not rebellion as humans would understand it, but correction, and from that correction came the first act that resembled violence. Cronus, a Titan, shaped not by kindness, but by inevitability. He did not rise to challenge Uranus out of justice. There was no concept of justice yet. He acted because the tension required release, and when he struck, it was not an act of chaos, it was an act of continuation. The world did not break, it changed. From that moment, something new entered existence. Not morality, not meaning, but pattern. A quiet understanding that what is powerful may still be replaced, that what emerges may also be undone. But this did not bring balance, it only deepened the structure of power. Because nothing in this world learned restraint. Nothing learned to protect what was weaker, or smaller, or more fragile. Existence continued as it had begun, unfolding without consideration. And in this unfolding, a silent truth settled into the fabric of reality. That to exist was to be exposed. That to emerge was to be vulnerable. And that nothing, neither force nor creation, nor time itself, would intervene to shield what could be broken. Long before names were given, before temples rose, before stories were told to make sense of what had already happened, this law had already taken root. It would remain unspoken. But it would shape everything, even her. After the first rupture, the world did not settle, it deepened. The act that separated Uranus from Gaia did not create peace, it created space. And within that space, something new began to take shape. Not gentleness, not balance, but expansion. A widening of existence where forces could grow without restraint, without the pressure that had once confined them. This was the age of the Titans. They did not arrive as rulers, they became so simply by enduring. Cronus stood among them, not as a king in the way later stories would describe, but as a centre of gravity, the one who had acted, the one through whom change had occurred. Power, in this early world, did not require coronation. It gathered around action, around consequence. And so, he ruled, not through decree, but through presence. The Titans were not unified. They were not bound by loyalty or shared vision. Each was an extension of something older, something elemental. Oceanus stretched into the endless waters, not governing them, but being them. Hyperion carried the quiet inevitability of light, though light itself had not yet found rhythm. Rhea, Gaia's daughter, bore within her the same silent endurance, though now shaped into something that could nurture as well as withstand. Yet even in her there was no true softness, because the world itself had not learned it. The Titans did not build. They did not create order in the way humans would later understand. They expanded. They filled the spaces left behind by the first separation. Their existence was not a response to chaos. It was a continuation of it, given form. Time, as humans perceive it, began to stretch here, not as measured hours or passing days, but as accumulation. Events no longer collapsed into one another without distinction. There were moments, if only faint ones, where something ended and something else began. And yet nothing truly ended. Everything remained. Uranus, though cast away, was not gone. His presence lingered, distant but unforgotten. Gaia endured beneath all things, unchanged in her role, though altered in her experience. The first act of division had not erased what came before. It had layered something new on top of it. This layering became the nature of the world. And within it, something uneasy began to grow. Cronus, who had acted without hesitation, began to feel the weight of continuation. Not guilt, such a concept had not yet formed, but awareness. A recognition that what he had done was not singular. It was repeatable. That what had happened to Uranus could happen again. Not through justice, not through rebellion, but through inevitability, because nothing in this world remained fixed. And so he began to watch, not with eyes alone, but with presence. A tightening of control, subtle at first. The Titans were vast, but they were not beyond influence. Power, once gathered, does not easily release its hold. It becomes cautious, it becomes guarded, and in that guardedness, something began to shift. Rhea, his consort, carried within her the possibility of continuation, not just of existence, but of lineage, a succession. The idea that something might come after, not just alongside. This was new, and it was dangerous, because succession implies replacement. The first children she bore did not grow as the Titans had. They were smaller, more defined. Their forms held something different, something that hinted at distinction, at individuality. They were not merely extensions of forces, they were beginnings of something that could become separate from what created them. Cronus saw this, and what he saw did not inspire wonder. It inspired reaction. The same pattern that had begun with Uranus now moved through him, not as a learned behaviour, but as an echo of the world's structure. What exists must preserve itself. What emerges must be contained. And so he began to act. Not with violence in the way humans would describe, but with finality. Each child that came into being was taken back into him, not destroyed, contained, removed from the world before it could fully exist within it. There was no hesitation, no pause. The act was immediate, inevitable, a continuation of the same logic that had shaped everything before it. Rhea endured this. She did not resist, not at first. Resistance, in this world, required a force equal to what it opposed, and she was not yet that force. She carried, she lost, she remained. But something was changing, not in the world, but in the pattern. Because repetition, even in a world without reflection, begins to gather weight. It begins to strain against itself. The same act, repeated, does not remain identical. It accumulates consequence, and consequence, though not guided by intention, begins to alter what comes next. The Titans ruled, but they did not understand what they were building. They believed themselves to be the continuation of power. But they were, in truth, preparing the ground for its transformation. Because beneath their vastness, beneath their endurance, something quieter was forming, something that would not simply be power, but would begin to shape it. The world had not yet learned restraint. But it was beginning to learn change, and change, once it takes root, does not remain still. The world did not announce its turning. There was no signal, no moment where silence broke into certainty. Change arrived the way it always had, quietly, beneath the surface of things already in motion. The Titans still stood, vast and unyielding, their presence stretched across existence like an unbroken horizon. Nothing appeared to challenge them. And yet, something had already begun. It started not with strength, but with concealment. Rhea, who had endured without interruption, made a single deviation from the pattern. When her youngest child came into being, she did not offer him to Cronus. She did not resist openly. She did not confront. Instead, she hid. The child was taken far from the centre of power, carried into a place untouched by the immediate reach of Titan rule. There, in a quiet distance, he was allowed to remain. This was Zeus. But he was not yet a god, as later stories would remember him. He was an interruption, a fracture in repetition, the first instance where inevitability did not complete itself, and because of that, the world shifted, though it did not yet realize it. Zeus did not rise quickly. His growth was not marked by triumph or destiny. He existed in waiting, shaped by time in a way the Titans had never been. He learned not by nature alone, but by observation, of distance, of absence, of what it meant to exist outside immediate power. And when he returned, he did not arrive as a conqueror. He arrived as consequence. Cronus, who had once acted without awareness, now faced something unfamiliar. Not rebellion, not chaos, but return. The pattern he had enforced began to unravel, not through force alone, but through exposure. What he had contained was no longer contained. Zeus did not stand alone. Around him gathered others, his siblings, released from the silence they had been forced into. Each carried within them something different from the Titans. Not greater power, but sharper edges, more defined presence. They were not vast in the same way, but they were precise, and precision, in a world built on enormity, begins to cut. The conflict that followed was not immediate. It did not erupt into battle without pause. There was a gathering first, a slow alignment of forces. The Titans remained where they had always been, anchored in their existence. The younger gods, the Olympians, moved differently. They formed connections, alliances, structures. This was new. Power had never needed to organize itself before. Now it did. And when the war began, it was not chaos returning, it was something more deliberate. The earth itself bore the weight of it. Mountains did not simply stand, they broke. The sky did not remain distant, it fractured with movement. The sea, once bound to its endless rhythm, surged beyond its own limits. Every layer of existence was drawn into the conflict, not by choice, but because there was no place untouched by power. The Titans fought as they had always existed, direct, overwhelming, vast. Their strength was undeniable, but it lacked adaptation. They did not change their nature, because they could not. The Olympians did something different. They adjusted, they learned within the conflict. They responded, not just with force, but with variation. Zeus, at the centre of this, did not rely on size or endurance, he relied on direction. His power moved, struck, withdrew, returned. It did not remain fixed. This difference began to matter. Because the world itself was no longer the same as it had been when the Titans first rose. It had layers now. It had memory. It had the faint beginnings of sequence, of before and after. And in such a world, unchanging power begins to fracture. The war stretched beyond what could be measured, not in years, not in time, but in intensity. It did not pause, it did not resolve itself quickly. Each moment fed into the next, building pressure, reshaping everything it touched. until finally the balance broke. Not suddenly, but completely. The Titans fell, not erased, but displaced, cast into Tartarus, into a depth that had existed long before them, now given purpose as a place of confinement. Their presence did not vanish. It was simply removed from the surface of the world, and in their place the Olympians stood. But this was not the arrival of order. It was the transformation of power. Because nothing fundamental had changed. The same forces still moved beneath everything, the same indifference, the same inevitability. The Olympians had not replaced this structure. They had inherited it. They gave it form. They gave it voice. They gave it names. But they did not soften it. Zeus ruled now, but his rule was not built on justice. It was built on continuation, of control, of preservation, of the same quiet truth that had always guided existence. That power must maintain itself, that what emerges may be undone, and that nothing, no matter how newly formed, is beyond repetition. The war had ended, but its meaning did not settle. Because in the space it created, something else began to take shape, not among the gods, but beneath them. A world where beings would exist not as forces, but as lives. Smaller, more fragile, more visible, and far less protected. After the war, the world did not become quieter, it became clearer. The great struggle had not erased the forces that shaped existence, it had revealed them, stripped them of distance, given them faces, voices, names. Where once there had been vast, indistinct presences, now there were figures who could be seen, imagined, invoked. The Olympians did not invent power, they translated it. Zeus did not become the sky, he gave it direction. Poseidon did not create the sea, he gave it will. Athena did not form thought, she gave it structure. Each god was not a ruler placed above a domain, but an embodiment sharpened into identity. And yet something remained unchanged beneath this transformation. Power did not become kinder, it became closer. This closeness is what defined the New Age. The distance that once existed between force and experience began to narrow. The world was no longer shaped by presences too vast to perceive. It was shaped by beings who could see, who could act, who could intervene. But intervention did not mean protection, it meant influence. The gods were not bound by fairness, nor guided by what might later be called virtue. They were bound only by their nature, and their nature was not separate from their power, it was an extension of it. To be a god was not to choose, it was to enact. Zeus did not decide to command, he was command. His presence carried authority not because he earned it, but because it could not be resisted. When he acted, the world shifted, not in response to his judgment, but in response to his existence. Athena did not learn wisdom, she was its expression, cold, precise, unyielding. Her clarity did not bend toward compassion, it cut through ambiguity, often leaving something broken behind it. Poseidon did not control the sea, he was its instability, its surges, its depths, its sudden violence. His desires moved like tides, pulling, receding, returning without explanation. This was the nature of divine power. It did not consider, it did not hesitate, and most importantly, it did not protect. Humans, when they would later emerge into this world, would misunderstand this. They would build temples, offer prayers, craft stories that tried to place the gods within a structure of meaning. They would speak of favour, of punishment, of reward. But the gods did not operate within such systems. They responded, not to morality, but to attention, to presence, to disruption. A god might notice a life, not because it was worthy, but because it intersected with something within their nature. And in that moment of noticing, everything could change. Not gradually, immediately. A blessing and a curse were not opposites. They were variations of the same act, an extension of divine force into something smaller, something unable to absorb it without consequence. This is why transformation became so common, not as metaphor, but as reality. To be seen by a god was to risk becoming something else, a tree, a bird, a shadow of what once was, or something far worse, because divine attention was not scaled to human fragility. It did not measure itself against what it touched. It simply acted, and what it touched had to endure the result, or be reshaped by it. There was no malice in this, but there was no restraint. And so, the world became a place of quiet tension, not constant chaos, not endless destruction, but something more subtle. A lingering awareness that beneath every moment of stillness there existed forces that could alter everything without warning. The sky could darken without storm. The sea could rise without wind. A life could change without reason. This unpredictability was not disorder. It was consistency. Because the gods, though they carried names and forms, remained bound to the same truth that had existed before them. That power does not serve. It expresses. An expression, when uncontained, does not distinguish between creation and destruction. In this world, to live was not to be safe. It was to exist within proximity to forces that did not see vulnerability as something to preserve, only as something that could be affected. And yet, humans would come to worship them, not because they misunderstood this nature completely, but because they understood just enough to know that power, even when indifferent, might still be turned, might still be directed, might still for a moment look upon them and not act, or act in a way that did not destroy. But this hope was fragile, because the gods were not bound to consistency in the way humans needed them to be. They did not promise. They did not remain. They did not answer in ways that could be relied upon. They were present, and then they were not. And in that absence, lives continued. Small lives, brief lives, lives that would one day intersect with these forces, not by choice, but by circumstance. And when that happened, the result would not be measured. It would not be weighed. It would simply unfold. As it always had, as it always would. They did not appear all at once. There was no single moment when the world declared that something had gone wrong. No dividing line between what was natural and what would later be called unnatural. The emergence of monsters was quieter than that, woven into the same fabric that had already shaped gods and titans alike. They were not interruptions. They were continuations. In the early world, creation had never been guided by harmony. It had always been an act of pressure, forces colliding, overlapping, reshaping one another without intention toward balance. From this pressure, forms emerged. Some held together, others did not, and those that did not, those became something else. Not mistakes, but excess. The first of these beings were not named as monsters. They simply existed at the edges of recognition. Creatures whose forms did not settle into a single pattern. Limbs that did not match their purpose. Bodies that seemed to carry more than one nature at once. A serpent that was not only a serpent. A lion that was not only a lion. A presence that could not be understood as a single thing. These were not created to frighten. Fear had not yet taken shape as a concept, but their existence unsettled the order that the Olympians were beginning to define. Not because they were chaotic, but because they revealed something uncomfortable, that the world was not cleanly divided, that form itself was unstable, that identity could fracture. The gods, who had begun to take clearer shapes, stood in contrast to these beings. Where the gods were defined, the monsters were not. Where the gods held domain, the monsters seemed to belong nowhere and everywhere. This is why they were pushed outward. Not destroyed, never fully erased, but placed at the edges of the world, into caves where light did not linger, onto islands where the sea formed a barrier more reliable than any wall, into regions that existed more as rumour than as place. Geography became a kind of distance, not just physical, but conceptual. The further something was from the centre of divine order, the less it needed to make sense, and so the monsters remained, not hidden, but removed. Their existence began to take on meaning, not because they changed, but because the world around them did. Humans, when they came into being, would look upon these creatures and see distortion. They would see warning. They would see something that had gone too far from what was acceptable. But the creatures themselves had not moved. It was the definition of acceptable that had narrowed. Many of these beings carried within them a strange kind of stillness, not peace, but isolation. They did not build societies, they did not form systems. They existed alone, or in small, quiet groupings, not because they chose solitude, but because nothing in the world had been made to receive them. They were not part of the divine order. But they were not outside existence either. They occupied a threshold, and thresholds are uneasy places, because they do not allow for clear understanding. A creature with the body of a woman and the wings of a bird does not simply exist. It challenges the idea of what a body should be. A being with multiple heads does not just appear. It questions the singularity of thought, of identity, of presence. These forms were not random. They were reflections, not of human fears, which had not yet fully formed, but of the world's own instability. The same forces that had shaped gods and titans had not disappeared. They had simply expressed themselves in different ways. Less controlled, less defined, more exposed, and in that exposure, something fragile became visible. Because monstrosity is not only about excess, it is also about vulnerability. A creature that does not fit cannot rely on the structures that protect those who do. It cannot move easily through the world. It cannot be overlooked. It is always seen, and to always be seen is to always be at risk. The monsters, in their distance, became symbols, not because they were meant to be, but because they could not avoid it. They marked the boundaries of what the world was willing to accept. Beyond them lay uncertainty. Within them, a kind of truth that could not be comfortably held. That form is not stable. That identity is not fixed. That creation does not guarantee belonging. Among these beings, some would become known by name. Their stories would be told not as lives, but as challenges to be overcome. Heroes would seek them out, not to understand them, but to end them, to restore a sense of order that their existence seemed to disturb. But the act of confronting a monster was never just about the creature. It was about what it represented, a crossing into something unfamiliar, a confrontation with what does not fit, and a return, if one was possible, back into the safety of definition. But not all monsters would remain at the edges. Some would stand closer to the centre, not fully within it, not entirely cast out, and among them there would be three. Sisters, bound not just by form but by fate. Two who would never change, and one who would. They did not begin as a story, they began as a presence. Far from the ordered peaks where the Olympians settled, beyond the regions where human lives would one day gather and name the world into familiarity, there existed a place that did not fully belong to either realm. It was not entirely removed, yet not entirely reachable. A threshold of distance where form loosened and meaning became less certain. It was here that the Gorgons were known, not as individuals at first, but as a shared existence. Three figures, bound not only by origin, but by something quieter, something that held them together even in stillness. They did not arrive into the world as intrusions. They emerged from it, shaped by the same forces that had given rise to everything else, yet carrying within them a difference that could not be overlooked. Steno, Euryale, and Medusa. Their names would come later, carried by those who needed to speak of them from a distance. But in their beginning, they did not require names. They were known through presence alone, through the effect they had on the world around them. Steno and Euryale were not like the creatures that had been pushed to the margins in quiet exile. They did not carry uncertainty in their form. They were fixed, enduring, and untouched by the fragility that would later define human life. Their existence did not waver. It did not change. They were immortal, not as a gift, but as a condition. To be unending in a world that constantly reshapes itself is not stability, it is separation. Time moved, but they did not move with it. They remained unaltered, while everything around them shifted, aged, dissolved, reformed. They did not belong to progression, they stood outside it, and because of this, they were not easily understood. Their forms reflected something older than the Olympian's order, hair that did not rest, but moved with a life of its own, eyes that did not simply see, but held a kind of presence that pressed outward. Their bodies carried both familiarity and distortion, not enough to be incomprehensible, but enough to resist comfort. They were not chaos, but they were not contained, and so they remained at the edges, not banished, not hunted, but kept at a distance through an unspoken understanding that what they were did not align with what the world was becoming. And then there was Medusa. She did not begin as they did. Where her sisters were fixed, she was not. Where they were unchanging, she carried within her the possibility of alteration. It was not immediately visible, not something that could be seen in her form, but it was present. A quiet difference. She was mortal. This did not make her weaker, it made her temporary. And in a world shaped by enduring forces, temporality is a fragile condition. To exist with an end is to move through time in a way others do not. It is to be shaped by it, marked by it, defined by its passing. Steno and Euryale did not experience this. Medusa did. She existed alongside them, yet not entirely within their state. A shared origin, but a divided nature. She could not remain as they remained. She would change, whether she chose to or not. And in that inevitability, something subtle began to form. A distance, not of place, but of being. It was not separation in the way humans understand loneliness. There was no language for that yet. But there was a difference in how the world touched her. Where her sisters endured without alteration, Medusa absorbed. Light shifted across her in ways that did not settle. Time moved through her, not around her. She was not anchored in the same stillness. And because of this, she was closer. Closer to something the world had only just begun to shape. Something that would one day be called human. This closeness did not bring protection. It brought exposure. Because to be closer to the centre of becoming is to be more visible, more reachable, more easily altered by forces that do not measure themselves against what they affect. The Gorgons did not seek the gods. But they were not beyond them. No one was. The distance that protected monsters was never absolute. It was only a delay, a space where attention had not yet settled. But attention, in a world governed by divine presence, does not remain still. It moves. It finds. And when it does not arrive gently. Steno and Euryale, in their unchanging forms, stood resistant to this movement. They could not be easily reshaped, not because they were stronger, but because they were already complete in their state. Medusa was not. She carried within her something unfinished. And unfinished things draw attention. not out of intention, but out of alignment. A moment would come when the distance between her and the gods would close, not because she reached toward them, but because something within their nature would move toward her. And when that moment arrived, it would not distinguish between what she was and what she would become. Before the serpents, before the gaze that would still the world into silence, there was a life that moved in smaller rhythms. It did not announce itself. It did not carry the weight of legend. It simply unfolded. Medusa, in this telling, was not born into terror. She was not shaped immediately into something the world would fear. Instead, she existed within it, quietly, visibly, and without the protection that distance once offered her kind. She walked where others walked. She breathed air that did not recoil from her presence. She was seen, not as something to be avoided, but as something to be recognized. And this, more than anything, made her vulnerable. To be mortal in a world of gods is not merely to die. It is to be reachable. Her life was not marked by grand events. There were no early signs of what she would become, no shadows cast ahead of her that hinted at transformation. She lived within the ordinary boundaries of human experience, though even these boundaries were never truly safe. She existed among structures that had begun to take shape, temples, rituals, spaces carved out in an attempt to bring order to a world that resisted it. And within these spaces she found a kind of place, not belonging, not fully, but proximity. She moved near the sacred, not as a figure of power, but as one who served it. The Temple of Athena stood as one of these places. It did not offer warmth. It did not invite comfort. It was built not to embrace, but to define, to draw clear lines between what was pure and what was not, between what could enter and what must remain outside. Within its walls, everything was measured. Sound did not echo freely. Movement was deliberate. Even light seemed to settle differently, as though aware that it had crossed into something structured, something controlled. Medusa existed within this environment as something that did not disrupt it. She adapted. Her movements became quieter, her presence more contained. She did not seek attention, but she could not avoid it entirely, because there was something about her that drew the eye, not in excess, not in distortion, but in clarity. Her form did not carry the strangeness of her sisters. It aligned, more closely than it should have, with what the world was beginning to accept as human. This alignment made her visible in a different way, not as an anomaly, but as something that fit. And yet even this carried its own danger, because what fits can be claimed, what is seen can be taken. Beauty, as it would later be called, is not protection, it is exposure refined. Medusa did not wield it, she carried it. And in carrying it, she became subject to the same forces that moved through the world without restraint. The temple did not shield her from this, it only placed her closer to it. Athena, whose presence defined the space, did not watch in the way humans would hope to be watched. She did not observe with care or concern. Her awareness was not personal, it was structural. She existed within the temple as its order, its discipline, its stillness. To be within her domain was not to be protected by her, it was to exist within the rules she embodied. And rules do not bend, they do not adapt to the fragile, they remain. Medusa moved within this structure, unaware that proximity to the divine is not safety, it is risk contained within boundaries that can shift without warning. Beyond the temple, the world continued to stretch outward, filled with forces that did not require invitation. Among them was the sea, restless, distant, yet never truly separate. It moved with its own rhythm, its own pull, carrying within it a presence that did not belong to stillness. Poseidon. He did not exist in opposition to Athena, nor in alignment. The gods did not divide themselves so cleanly. They overlapped, intersected, moved through one another's domains without permission. And where they intersected, tension formed. Not conflict as humans understand it, but pressure. Forces pressing against each other without resolution. Medusa, in her mortality, stood at a point where such forces could converge, not because she sought it, but because she could not prevent it. Her life, which had unfolded quietly, began to gather something heavier, not event, not change, but attention. A subtle shift in the way the world regarded her, the way presence lingered a moment longer than it should. This is how transformation begins, not with action, but with focus. Because in a world governed by gods, to be noticed is to be altered. Not gradually, but completely. And Medusa, who had lived within the fragile safety of being seen as human, had begun to cross into something else. Something that could not remain untouched. It stood where sound seemed to hesitate. Not because it was silent, but because everything within it moved with restraint. Even footsteps, once they crossed its threshold, lost their certainty. They softened, as if the ground itself demanded a different kind of presence. The temple was not built to comfort, it was built to define. Stone rose in deliberate lines, columns that did not reach upward in longing, but in precision. Each surface carried intention. Nothing curved without reason. Nothing existed without placement. It was not a place that welcomed life as it was. It reshaped it into something quieter, something more controlled. This was the domain of Athena, not a goddess who arrived in storms or tremors, but one who settled into form. Her presence did not overwhelm, it ordered. It aligned. It drew boundaries where none had existed before, and then refused to let them blur. Within this space, chaos was not destroyed, it was excluded. Medusa moved within these walls as something that had learned to adapt to their stillness. Her steps followed patterns not spoken aloud, but understood through repetition. There were paths that could be taken, and paths that could not. There were gestures that belonged, and gestures that did not. She learned them, not out of devotion, but out of necessity. The temple did not forgive deviation. It did not punish it either, not directly. It simply resisted it. A presence that did not align would feel it immediately. A subtle pressure that made movement heavier, sound sharper, existence more exposed. To remain here, one had to become smaller, more precise, more contained. Medusa understood this without ever being told. Her voice, when it was used, did not rise beyond what the space could hold. Her gaze did not linger where it was not meant to. She moved as if aware that every action left a trace, and that traces within these walls did not fade easily. This was not fear, it was adjustment. Athena did not watch her in the way a guardian watches. There was no presence that followed Medusa from room to room, no awareness that centered itself upon her specifically. Athena existed throughout the temple, not as an observer, but as a condition. To be inside was to be within her, and within her everything was measured. Purity, in this place, was not innocence. It was alignment. A life that fit perfectly within the structure was considered unbroken. A life that deviated, even slightly, carried within it the suggestion of disorder. Medusa did not question this. Questions did not belong here, only adherence. Yet outside the temple, the world did not follow the same rules. The sea continued its restless movement. The sky shifted without permission. The gods, though they held their domains, did not remain confined within them. Their presences crossed boundaries without hesitation, because boundaries were not barriers to them, they were lines drawn for others, and sometimes those lines were not enough. The temple stood near enough to the world to feel it. The air carried traces of salt, faint but persistent. The wind did not stop entirely at its edges. It softened, but it did not disappear. Something of the outside always remained, subtle, almost unnoticed, but never absent. This closeness was a quiet vulnerability, because Athena's domain was defined by control, and the world beyond it was not. Medusa, in her movement between these spaces, carried both within her. The discipline of the temple shaped her, but it did not erase what lay outside. She existed at an intersection, not fully of one, not entirely removed from the other. And intersections do not remain stable. They draw movement. They draw attention. There were moments, small, nearly imperceptible, when the stillness of the temple seemed to shift. Not visibly, not in a way that could be named, but in a subtle tension that passed through the air. A presence that did not belong entirely to Athena's order, yet did not fully disrupt it either. These moments did not linger. They passed. But they left something behind. A sense that the boundaries, though strong, were not absolute. That what lay beyond them could approach, not by force, but by nature. Because the gods did not require entry. They did not need permission. They moved where their presence aligned, and where it aligned, it settled. The temple, for all its structure, was not beyond this. It was only more resistant. But resistance is not immunity. Medusa continued her life within these walls, shaped by their stillness, defined by their quiet demands. She remained within the patterns she had learned, within the boundaries that had been drawn long before she arrived. But something had begun to change, not within the temple, within the space around it. A shift so slight it could not yet be understood, only felt. Like the first movement beneath still water, unseen, but already altering everything. It did not arrive suddenly. There was no moment when Medusa became aware that she was different. No single reflection that revealed something newly formed. Instead it unfolded slowly, through glances that lingered too long, through silences that gathered around her presence, through a quiet shift in how the world responded when she entered it. Beauty, in this world, was not an adornment. It was an exposure. It did not belong to the one who carried it. It moved outward into the perception of others, where it was shaped, interpreted, and claimed. Medusa did not create it, nor could she control it. She simply existed within it, as one exists within light, visible whether one wishes to be or not. Within the temple, this visibility did not disappear. It changed. The stillness of Athena's domain did not erase attention. It refined it. Where the outside world allowed attention to move freely, the temple held it in place. It did not scatter. It focused. And in that focus, Medusa became something more defined. Not by her own actions, but by the way others began to see her. There were no words spoken. The temple did not encourage them. But presence carries its own language. A hesitation in movement, a slight turning of the head, a pause that was too long to be accidental, yet too brief to be acknowledged. These were not acts of admiration, they were acts of recognition. Recognition of something that did not fully belong within the structure that surrounded it. Athena's temple valued clarity, discipline, restraint. Beauty, as Medusa carried it, did not align perfectly with these values. It was not disorder, but it was not neutral either. It drew the eye, and in drawing the eye, it disrupted the quiet equilibrium the temple sought to maintain. Not violently, but persistently. Medusa began to feel this, not as discomfort, but as awareness. A subtle understanding that her presence altered the space around her, even when she remained still. That something about her could not fully disappear into the order she tried to follow. She did not resist this, she adjusted. Her movements became more measured, her gaze lowered more often. She occupied less space, not physically, but perceptually, trying, without fully knowing it, to lessen the effect she had on the world around her. But beauty does not diminish through concealment. It sharpens. What is partially hidden becomes more defined in the act of being withheld. The effort to quiet it only makes its presence more pronounced, more precise, more difficult to ignore, and so the attention did not fade, it deepened. Outside the temple, the world responded differently. There, beauty was not restrained by structure. It moved freely, drawing response without limitation. But this freedom did not bring safety. It brought unpredictability. To be seen in such a world is to invite interpretation. And interpretation, when guided by forces that do not measure themselves, becomes something unstable. Medusa did not seek the gaze of others, but she could not avoid it, and among those who could see, there were beings for whom seeing was not passive. The gods did not observe as humans did. Their attention was not separate from their influence. To notice was to act. To focus was to alter. Beauty, when it crossed into the awareness of such beings, did not remain as it was. It became something else. Not enhanced, not diminished, but transformed. Medusa, standing at the intersection of mortal fragility and divine proximity, carried within her a kind of visibility that could not remain unnoticed forever. It was not her actions that drew this attention. It was alignment. Something in her form, in her presence, in the way she existed within the world, resonated with forces beyond her control. Not intentionally, not meaningfully, but inevitably. And inevitability in this world does not wait. It gathers, slowly, quietly, until it reaches a point where it can no longer remain still. Beauty in such a world is not a gift, it is a signal, a quiet marking of something that will not remain untouched. And Medusa, though she did not yet understand it, had already been marked, not by choice, not by action, but by being seen. And once something is seen by the gods, it does not return to what it was before. It cannot. Because the gaze of a god does not pass lightly. It lingers. It alters. It decides without speaking. The temple could not shield her from this. Its walls could define space, but they could not redirect attention that did not follow human boundaries. Something had begun to turn toward her, not with intention, but with recognition. And recognition, in the presence of power, is never without consequence. They did not look all at once. There was no moment when the heavens turned in unison, no sudden convergence of attention that marked her as chosen or condemned. The gaze of the gods did not behave like human sight. It did not sweep across the world in search of meaning. It settled, quietly, without announcement. And once it settled, it did not easily move away. Medusa did not see this happening. There were no signs that could be named, no voice that spoke, no presence that stood before her in form. The gods rarely arrived so directly. Their attention was something else, less visible, more pervasive. It existed not in front of her, but around her. Within the subtle shifts of the world itself, a stillness that lingered longer than it should, a sense that something had paused, not in interruption, but in focus. This is how the gods watched, not always with intention, but never without consequence. Athena's presence remained constant within the temple. It did not waver, it did not narrow or expand. It was the structure itself, the discipline that held everything in place. Her awareness did not sharpen toward Medusa. It did not single her out. And yet, it did not protect her either, because Athena's nature was not to intervene in moments that did not disrupt her order. And Medusa, in her quiet adjustment, had not yet disrupted anything. She remained within the lines. She followed the form. She did not break the pattern. And so, Athena remained still. But not all gods were still. Far beyond the temple, the sea moved as it always had, restless, uncontained, carrying within it a presence that did not settle into fixed boundaries. It touched distant shores without asking. It reshaped edges without permission. It reached where it was not invited, because it did not recognize the concept of invitation. Poseidon did not look in the way Athena did not look. His attention was not structured. It was drawn. Like a current, it moved toward what aligned with it, not by decision, but by nature. Something in the world shifted, and his presence followed. Something resonated, and his awareness deepened. Medusa did not call to him. But something about her existed in a way that could not remain unnoticed. Not her actions, not her voice, but her presence, her visibility, sharpened by beauty, contained within structure, yet not entirely defined by it. This is what draws attention in such a world, not effort, but alignment. The sea does not seek, it responds, and when it responds, it does not measure. It arrives. At first, it was distant, a subtle pressure, like the faint pull of a tide, not yet visible. The air carried something heavier, though nothing had changed in form. The temple remained as it had always been, still, precise, unyielding, but within that stillness, something began to shift, not in the stone, not in the structure, but in the space between. Medusa moved as she always had, unaware that the nature of her being was beginning to intersect with something far larger than herself. She could not perceive the attention that gathered, because it did not manifest in ways she could recognize. It did not approach her, it surrounded her. The gods do not enter a place, they alter it. And as Poseidon's presence moved closer, not physically, but through alignment, the world around Medusa began to feel less stable. The boundaries that had once seemed firm no longer held the same certainty. The separation between inside and outside, between sacred and untouched, began to blur, not visibly, but inevitably. Athena's temple resisted this. Its structure held, its order remained, but resistance is not absence. Something had entered the space, not in form, but in influence. An influence, once present, does not leave without consequence. The gods did not speak to one another about this. They did not negotiate. They did not intervene in the ways humans might expect, because their natures did not require agreement. They overlapped. They pressed against each other, not as enemies, but as forces that could not fully coexist without tension. Athena remained what she was, unmoving, precise, defined. Poseidon remained what he was, shifting, reaching, uncontained. And Medusa stood where these two presences met, not by choice, not by design, but by circumstance. This is the danger of being seen in such a world. Not all attention is equal. Some passes without effect, some alters without warning, and some, once it settles, does not release. Medusa had not sought the gaze of the gods, but she had not been hidden from it either, and now something had begun to focus. Not with judgment, not with intention as humans understand it, but with inevitability, the kind that does not ask whether it should act. Only when. And once it acts, it does not reverse. It does not soften. It does not undo. It simply leaves the world different than it was before. It did not begin as desire, not in the way humans would later name it, with intention or longing or choice. What moved through the sea was not guided by restraint, nor shaped by reflection. It did not pause to consider what it reached toward. It did not ask what should remain untouched. It moved because it could not remain still. This was the nature of Poseidon. He did not stand apart from the sea. He was its restlessness given awareness, its shifting depths, its sudden violence, its quiet, endless pull. Where Athena defined and contained, Poseidon dissolved and spread. He did not recognise boundaries as limits, only as temporary edges meant to be pressed against, worn down, eventually crossed. And so, when his attention settled upon Medusa, it did not arrive as a decision, it arrived as alignment. Something in her existence resonated, not with meaning, but with presence. A stillness shaped by structure, yet not entirely held by it. A form that carried clarity, yet remained vulnerable to what lay beyond it. The sea responds to such things, not because it understands them, but because it cannot ignore them. At first, it was distant, a subtle disturbance, like a tide turning far from shore. The air near the temple held a faint trace of salt, though no wave had touched its walls. The wind moved differently, not stronger, not louder, but heavier, as though carrying something unseen within it. These were not signs, they were shifts. The world adjusting to the presence of something that did not belong entirely within its current shape. Medusa did not recognise this. How could she? The gods did not announce themselves. They did not enter a place as one enters a room. They altered what was already there, until the space itself began to feel different. Until it no longer held the same certainty. Poseidon's attention deepened, not as focus narrows, but as depth increases. Like the sea itself, it did not fix upon a single point. It expanded around it, surrounding, pressing inward without ever needing to strike. Desire in this form is not directed. It is inevitable. It does not seek permission. It does not recognize refusal. It simply moves toward what it has already begun to claim. The temple, with all its precision, felt this intrusion, not as a break, but as a strain. Its structure held, but something within it tightened. The air no longer settled as it once had. The silence was no longer complete. Athena's presence did not retreat. But it did not intervene, because what was unfolding did not violate her nature. It intersected with it. And where divine forces intersect, there is no negotiation, only outcome. Medusa moved within this shifting space, unaware that the ground beneath her existence was beginning to alter. The patterns she had followed still remained, but they no longer carried the same certainty. Something beneath them had begun to loosen, not visibly, but irrevocably. Poseidon did not approach her as a figure. He did not need to. His presence filled the distance before form could ever take shape. It moved through the world itself, through air, through silence, through the unseen currents that connected one place to another. This is how the sea reaches. It does not ask to enter, it arrives. And when it arrives, it does not remain at the edges. It moves inward. There is no hesitation in this movement, no moment of pause where something might turn away, because the nature of such power is not to consider its effect, only to express itself. Medusa stood at the centre of this convergence, not because she had chosen it, but because she could not step outside it. Her mortality, her visibility, her presence within a structured space that could not fully contain what lay beyond it, all of this placed her exactly where such forces would meet. And when they meet, something must give. Not by judgment, not by decision, but by the simple fact that one form cannot remain unchanged when touched by another of greater force. The temple could not prevent this. Its walls were not barriers to the divine. Its order was not stronger than what moved beyond it. It could only hold for as long as it was not directly altered. But alteration had already begun. The air thickened. The stillness broke, not into sound, but into tension. Something was arriving, not as a storm, not as violence, but as presence that could no longer remain distant. And Medusa, who had once lived within the fragile safety of being unseen by such forces, now stood within their focus. Not chosen, not spared, simply reached. Because in this world, desire does not belong to the one who is desired, it belongs to the one who cannot stop moving toward it. It did not shatter. The temple did not collapse, nor did its columns crack beneath some visible force. There was no storm that tore through its structure, no sound that announced what was about to unfold. Instead, something quieter occurred. A disturbance that did not break the temple, but altered it. The air shifted first, not in movement, but in weight. What had once settled cleanly within the space now seemed to linger, as though something unseen had entered and refused to pass through. The stillness, once complete, became uneven. Not gone, but fractured into something less certain. The temple remained as it was, but it was no longer untouched. Athena's presence did not withdraw. It remained precise, unmoving, embedded in every line and surface. But presence does not prevent intrusion. It does not seal space from what lies beyond it. It defines, but definition is not protection. And so, what should not have entered, did. Poseidon did not arrive as a figure crossing a threshold. He arrived as a presence that erased the meaning of the threshold itself. The separation between outside and inside dissolved, not visibly, but fundamentally. The boundary that had once held the temple apart from the rest of the world no longer carried the same certainty. The sea does not stop at edges, it overtakes them. And here it did so without water, without wave, without sound. Medusa felt it before she understood it. A pressure, not against her body, but within the space she occupied, as though the air itself had grown dense, resisting movement, narrowing possibility. The patterns she had followed so carefully no longer guided her in the same way. Something had shifted beyond them. She did not step out of place. But place itself was no longer stable. The temple, which had always demanded alignment, now held within it something that could not align. Two forces, both absolute, both unyielding, overlapping. And in that overlap, something fragile was caught. Medusa did not call for help. There was no language for what was happening, no understanding that could form in time to resist it, because what moved toward her was not an action that could be refused. It was a force expressing itself. Poseidon's presence did not hesitate. It did not recognize the sanctity of the temple. Because sanctity is a human idea, a structure imposed upon the world, not one that binds the gods. The temple was Athena's domain, but domains do not exclude one another. They intersect, and in that intersection, the stronger force does not always prevail. It simply continues. What unfolded was not witnessed, not in the way stories would later attempt to describe. There were no eyes to record it, no voices to speak it as it occurred. Even Athena, whose presence filled the temple, did not intervene, not because she was absent, but because her nature did not move in that direction. She was order, she was boundary. But boundaries, once crossed, do not reassert themselves in the moment of crossing. They remain. And the crossing happens anyway. Medusa stood within that moment, not as participant, not as agent, but as something that could not withstand what had already begun. Her mortality, her visibility, her proximity to forces beyond her scale, these did not protect her. They placed her exactly where she could be altered. The temple did not break. But it was changed. Its stillness, once absolute, now carried something beneath it, an imprint that would not fade. The air would settle again, the silence would return, the structure would remain intact. But something had entered it that could not be undone. And Medusa, who had once moved within its order, was no longer the same. Not yet in form, but in state. Because there are moments that divide existence not into before and after, but into what can no longer return. This was such a moment. Poseidon's presence did not linger. The sea does not remain where it has passed. It moves on, leaving behind only what has been reshaped by it, and Athena remained, unmoved, unaltered, but not untouched, because the temple, though still hers, now held within it something that did not belong to her nature, something that had occurred within her domain, without her consent, and yet not without consequence. Medusa remained where she was. But she was no longer within the same world, not because the world had changed, but because she had been moved within it, placed somewhere else. A place that did not yet have a name, but would soon be defined, not by what had been done, but by what would follow. Nothing followed. No voice descended from the sky. No tremor moved through the earth in response. No sign appeared that something had gone wrong, at least, not in the way the world might have expected, had it been capable of expectation. The temple stood. The air settled. The structure of things returned to its quiet alignment. And yet what had occurred did not belong to silence. But silence was all that came. The gods did not speak of it, not because they were unaware. Awareness among them was not limited by distance or by form. What happened within one domain did not remain hidden from the others. It simply did not compel them to act. This is the nature of divine stillness. It is not absence, it is indifference. Athena remained within her temple, unchanged in presence, unchanged in form. Her order reasserted itself, as it always did. The lines were still drawn. The boundaries still existed. The discipline of the space did not collapse under what had passed through it. But something had been marked, not visibly, not in a way that could be pointed to or named. But the temple, though still precise, now held within it a memory, not of thought, but of event, a trace that did not disturb its structure, yet could not be removed from it. And Athena did not erase it. She did not undo what had been done. Because undoing is not within the nature of such power. The gods do not reverse, they continue. Poseidon had already moved on. The sea does not remain where it has broken its boundary. It returns to its own vastness, leaving behind only what it has altered. His presence did not linger in the temple. It did not circle back. It did not acknowledge what had been left in its wake. It simply receded, as though nothing had required recognition, and in that absence something became clear. There would be no response, no balancing act, no correction. What had occurred would remain as it was. Medusa remained as well, but not as she had been. She stood within the same space, beneath the same structure, within the same quiet order, but something in her had shifted beyond return. Not yet in form, not yet in visible change, but in position. She was no longer where she had been in the world, not because she had moved, but because the world had moved around her. The gods did not acknowledge this. They did not gather. They did not deliberate. There was no counsel, no weighing of outcome, no consideration of consequence. These are human constructs, ways of imposing logic upon a system that does not operate through it. The divine does not judge, it does not measure, it does not intervene to restore balance, because balance in this world is not maintained, it is temporary. And once disrupted, it does not return to what it was, it becomes something else. Athena's silence was not approval, it was not agreement, it was continuation. She remained what she was, unchanging, precise, bound to the nature that defined her. The violation of her space did not transform her into something else. It did not compel her to act outside her form, and so she did not act. This is the quiet cruelty of such a world, not cruelty as intention, but as structure, because there is no place within it where something like this demands response. No force that rises automatically to protect. No presence that intervenes simply because something fragile has been broken. Only continuation. Only unfolding. Medusa existed within this continuation, but she did not move through it as she once had. The pattern she had followed no longer held meaning in the same way. The temple's order, once something she could align with, now stood around her like a shape she no longer fit within, not because it had changed, but because she had. And change, once it takes hold, does not remain hidden. It reveals itself, slowly, inevitably. The silence of the gods did not prevent this, it allowed it, because in their stillness there is no interruption, no pause, no moment where what has begun might be stopped before it completes itself. The world continued, the temple remained, the gods held their places, and within that stillness something irreversible began to rise, not from the outside, not from the gods, but from within Medusa herself. A transformation not yet visible, but already certain, because silence in such a world is not peace, it is permission. It did not come as anger. There was no sudden fracture in the sky, no surge of force that announced a response. Athena did not arrive in reaction, because reaction is not the nature of what she is. She does not move in impulse. She does not act from disruption. She resolves. And resolution, in her form, does not ask what is fair. It asks what must remain intact. The temple stood unchanged in structure, but its meaning had shifted. Something had occurred within it that did not belong to its order. Not something visible, not something that could be removed like an object misplaced. It was deeper than that, woven into the space itself, into the memory of what the temple now contained. Athena did not undo this. She could not because she lacked power, but because her nature did not reach backward. It did not reverse events. It did not restore what had been altered. It moved forward, defining what would follow. And what would follow required correction, not of the act, but of its consequence. Medusa stood within this quiet recalibration, unaware that she had already been placed within its centre. She had not been asked. She had not been considered. She had simply become the point where something unresolved now rested. Athena's awareness did not settle upon her as an individual. It settled upon imbalance. The temple, once absolute in its definition, now contained something that did not align. A presence that no longer fit within its clarity. Medusa, altered though not yet visibly changed, carried within her the trace of what had crossed into this space. And that trace could not remain. Not here. Athena did not see Medusa as harmed, she saw her as altered. This distinction is quiet, but it is everything. To recognise harm is to acknowledge something that requires care. To recognise alteration is to acknowledge something that requires removal. Athena did not move with cruelty. But she did not move with protection either. She moved with precision, the kind that does not hesitate. The kind that does not soften itself to accommodate what has already been broken. Because in her nature, what is broken does not become whole again. It becomes something else. And that something must be defined. The transformation did not begin with form. It began with decision. A silent alignment of what would be allowed to remain, and what would not. Medusa could not remain within the temple as she was, not because she had acted, not because she had chosen, but because she had become incompatible. An incompatibility within divine order does not linger. It is resolved. Athena's presence did not descend. It did not surround Medusa in light or shadow. It was already there. It had always been there. But now it shifted, not in strength, but in direction. A focus that narrowed, not toward the act that had occurred, but toward the result it had left behind. Medusa felt this shift, not as pain, not as fear, but as a quiet removal, as though the world around her had begun to pull away, not violently, but with certainty. The space that had once held her now seemed to release her, not gently, but without resistance. She no longer belonged to, and belonging, once lost, does not return. Athena's judgment was not spoken. It did not need to be. It existed in the unfolding itself, in what began to happen next, in the way the world adjusted around Medusa, in the subtle but irreversible movement that carried her away from what she had been part of. There was no trial, no accusation, no recognition of innocence or guilt, only a decision, and decisions, in the hands of the divine, do not require explanation. Because they are not made to be understood, they are made to take effect. The temple remained. Its order restored, not by undoing what had occurred, but by removing what no longer fit within it. Athena remained. Unchanged, untouched in her nature, but the world around Medusa began to loosen, as though preparing to reshape her into something that could exist elsewhere, outside the clarity, outside the structure, outside the space where she had once moved in quiet alignment. This is how divine judgment unfolds, not as punishment for action, but as correction of presence. Medusa had not been asked who she was. She had not been given a choice in what she had become. But now, what she would be was no longer hers to remain. It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment where Medusa ceased to be what she had been. No instant where the world split cleanly into before and after. Instead, the change unfolded slowly, as though the body itself resisted the shape it was being asked to take. The temple was no longer around her. Not physically, its structure still stood, its silence still held, but she was no longer within it in the same way. Something had already begun to separate her from it, to move her outward, away from its clarity, its discipline, its refusal to bend. What remained was not a place. It was a transition. Her body felt it first, not as pain, but as unfamiliarity, a quiet dissonance, as though what had once been seamless was now beginning to misalign. Her skin no longer carried the same certainty. The air did not touch her as it once had. Even stillness felt altered, as though beneath it something continued to move. She did not understand. But understanding was never part of the process. Change, in this world, does not explain itself, it imposes. Her hair shifted. At first, it was almost nothing. An unease at the edges of sensation, a subtle awareness that what rested upon her shoulders was no longer entirely still. A faint movement where there should have been none. Then, more. Not strands falling, not texture changing, but motion, independent, deliberate, without rhythm. Each strand no longer bound to the whole, but separating, awakening into something that did not belong to her will. She did not reach for it. She did not try to hold it in place. Because even in that moment, something within her understood this was not something that could be stopped. The transformation did not ask for consent. It continued. Her reflection, had she seen it, would not have revealed everything at once. The changes did not present themselves clearly. They emerged in fragments, in pieces that did not yet form a complete image. Eyes that held something heavier, skin that no longer carried softness in the same way, a presence that did not rest easily within its own shape, and beneath it all, something deeper. A shift not just in form, but in how the world responded to her. The space around her began to react, not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly, inevitably. Where once her presence had drawn attention, now it began to repel. The air did not settle near her in the same way. The ground beneath her felt less certain, as though even it did not fully accept what she was becoming. She was no longer aligned, not with the temple, not with the world she had known. The transformation moved inward. Her senses altered, not sharpened, not dulled, but redirected. The way she perceived space, distance, presence, all of it shifted, as though she were no longer placed within the world, but set slightly apart from it. Isolation did not come after. It began here. Her gaze changed last. It did not happen in a moment she could name. There was no instant where she realized what her eyes had become. It emerged gradually, quietly, until the world itself began to respond differently to being seen by her. Objects seemed to resist her attention, not physically, but in stillness, as though the act of looking had gained weight, as though her gaze carried something more than sight. She did not test it, she did not understand it, but it was already there. The transformation was not violent, it did not tear her apart, it redefined her, carefully, completely. By the time it settled, there was no part of her that remained untouched. Not because everything had changed beyond recognition, but because nothing had been left as it was. And yet something remained. Not in form, not in appearance, but in awareness. A quiet presence within her that recognized the distance between what she had been and what she now was. Not as memory, but as absence. Because what had been taken was not replaced. It was removed, and what remained in its place was something the world would not receive in the same way. The gods did not return to witness this. Athena did not watch the final shape take form. Poseidon did not look back. The transformation did not require their presence to complete itself. It had already been set in motion. And once set in motion, such things do not stop. They do not reconsider. They do not soften. They reach their end. Medusa stood at that end. Not as she had been, not yet as she would be understood, but as something newly defined, placed outside the structures that had once contained her, reshaped into a form that did not belong within them, a form that would not be welcomed, a form that would not be protected, a form that would be seen and feared. It did not reveal itself immediately. There was no moment when Medusa understood what her gaze had become. No instant where the world demonstrated its new response in a way she could recognize and name. Instead, it unfolded the same way all things had unfolded for her, quietly, without explanation, without warning. The change had already taken place. What remained was its discovery. She moved through a space that no longer felt anchored. The world around her had grown distant, not in sight, but in connection. What she looked upon did not return her presence in the same way. There was a subtle resistance, as though the act of seeing had become something heavier, something that pressed outward rather than simply receiving. At first, it was only a feeling, a quiet dissonance. Then, something answered it. A small movement barely noticed. A living thing, fragile and unaware, crossed into her line of sight. There was no intention behind her gaze, no reaching, no force applied. She simply looked. And the world responded, not with sound, not with struggle, but with stillness. A stillness too complete to belong to life. It was not death as it had been known before. There was no falling, no fading, no gradual absence. What occurred was immediate, absolute. Movement ceased, not slowly, not partially, but entirely, as though time itself had withdrawn from what she had seen. The shape remained. But the life within it did not. Stone did not form as a transformation one could watch. It was not a process unfolding in stages. It was an outcome, arrived at without transition. One moment, there was motion. The next, there was none. Medusa did not understand. She looked again. not in curiosity, not in testing, but because looking is instinct, because sight, once given, cannot easily be withheld. And again, the world answered. Stillness. Unbroken. Unyielding. The ground began to hold shapes that did not belong to it, forms caught in the last moment of being, preserved not as memory, but as permanence. The space around her no longer shifted in response to life, it collected it. She stepped back, not in fear, but in uncertainty, but distance did not change what had already become part of her. Her gaze was no longer passive, it did not simply observe, it acted. Not by intention, but by nature. This is how divine consequence settles into form, not as a tool, not as something to be used, but as something that cannot be turned off. Medusa did not wield this power, she carried it, and in carrying it she became separate from everything it touched. The world began to withdraw from her, not consciously, not deliberately, but inevitably. What lived could not remain near her without risk. What moved could not pass through her presence without the possibility of ending. She did not need to reach for it. It existed in every moment of her awareness, in every direction her eyes could turn. And so, she learned something without being taught. Not through instruction, but through absence. She learned to lower her gaze, not as discipline, not as obedience, but as necessity. To look was to alter, to see was to end, and so she began to move through the world without meeting it fully. But even this was not enough. Because the world is not still, it moves, it shifts, it crosses paths without warning. And when it did, when something entered her sight without her seeking it, the outcome did not change. Stone, always stone. There was no variation, no moment where the effect lessened, no instance where it failed. The consistency of it was what made it absolute, what made it final. Medusa's existence became defined by this, not by what she did, but by what happened in her presence. She no longer needed to act to change the world. Her being was enough. And in this, something quiet and irreversible settled over her. Isolation. Not imposed, not declared, but formed through consequence. There was no place she could go where this would not follow, no distance that would remove it, no boundary that could contain it. Her eyes did not belong to her alone anymore, they belonged to the force that had reshaped her. And that force did not soften, it did not yield, it did not stop. The world, which had once seen her, now avoided being seen by her, and in that reversal, everything changed. Because to be unseen is one kind of absence, but to be unseeable is another entirely. She was not forced to leave. No god appeared before her to command it. No hand pushed her beyond the threshold. There was no moment where exile was declared, no word spoken that named what was happening. And yet, she could not remain. The temple did not close its doors, it simply stopped holding her. The silence within it, once steady and complete, no longer settled around her in the same way. The air resisted her presence, not sharply, not violently, but with a quiet certainty. The patterns she had once followed no longer aligned beneath her steps. She had not moved. But the place had shifted around her. Or perhaps she had shifted beyond it, and so she stepped away, not as departure, as continuation. The ground outside did not greet her, it did not recognise her passage as something natural. Each step felt slightly misaligned, as though the world beneath her had not yet decided how to receive what she had become. She did not look back, not because she chose not to, but because looking had already become something she could not trust. And so she moved forward without seeing fully, guided not by direction, but by absence. The further she walked, the less the world resisted her, not because it accepted her, but because there was less left to resist. The signs of life began to thin. Movement became rare. Sound softened until it no longer carried meaning, only distance. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as though uncertain how to pass through a space that no longer belonged to anything living. This was not a path, it was a gradual removal. The world did not end. It loosened. Edges blurred, boundaries faded. What had once been structured became open, undefined, less a place, more a condition. And in that condition she continued. Until something changed. Not suddenly, but unmistakably. The ground held stillness differently here, not as absence of motion, but as its conclusion. Stone figures stood scattered across the land, not arranged, not placed, simply left where they had become what they now were. Some stood upright, caught mid-step. Others collapsed into shapes that suggested a final movement never completed. Their forms remained detailed, precise, held in a permanence that did not belong to time. They did not decay. They did not fade. They endured. Medusa did not need to look closely to understand. This was where her gaze belonged, not because it was welcomed, but because it was no longer out of place. She had reached the edge, not of distance, but of acceptance. Here nothing recoiled, nothing avoided her, because there was nothing left to withdraw. The sky above felt wider, not in size, but in emptiness. It stretched without interruption, without the grounding presence of life beneath it. The horizon did not promise anything beyond itself. It simply remained. And in that stillness, she was not alone. Steno and Euryale were there, as they had always been, unchanged, unmoving in the way that time moves through everything else. They did not turn toward her, they did not acknowledge her arrival. Their presence did not shift to receive her. They existed, as they always had, complete within themselves, untouched by what had brought her here. But something had changed. Not in them, in her. Where once she had stood apart from them, mortal, shifting, uncertain, now that difference had quieted. Not erased, but diminished. She no longer carried the same fragile alignment with the world she had come from. She had been moved, not into their likeness, but into their distance. This was not reunion, it was convergence. Three figures, bound not by closeness, but by separation from everything else. The land did not name them. It did not recognize them as beings that belonged or did not belong. It simply held them, as it held the stone forms scattered across its surface, without judgment, without distinction. Medusa remained there, not because she chose to stay, but because there was nowhere left to go. Exile does not end in arrival. It settles, quietly, completely, until movement itself loses meaning. She had not been sent away. She had been placed, not by command, but by consequence. And here, at the edge of the world, consequence did not pursue further. It rested, as still as the figures that surrounded her, as silent as the sky above, as permanent as what she had become. It did not behave like punishment. There was no rhythm to it, no pattern that could be learned and avoided. It did not arrive only when she acted, nor did it fade when she was still. It existed without condition, constant, unyielding, embedded into her being in a way that could not be separated from it. This is what made it a curse, not its severity, but its permanence. Medusa did not awaken each day to something new. There was no progression, no escalation. What she had become remained fixed, unchanged, repeating itself not through time, but through presence. Her gaze did not weaken. It did not grow stronger. It simply remained absolute. And within that absoluteness, something unsettling revealed itself. The curse did not distinguish. It did not recognize intent. It did not respond to emotion, to thought, to restraint. It did not care whether she wished it to happen. It did not wait for her to act. It existed as part of her, and through her the world was altered. This is the difference between power and burden. Power can be directed, a burden cannot. Medusa did not control what she carried. She endured it. At times, she would remain still for long stretches, her gaze lowered, her body unmoving, as though by reducing herself she might lessen the reach of what she had become. But stillness did not remove it, it only delayed its consequence. Because the world moves, and movement eventually crosses paths. A bird passing overhead, a creature wandering without awareness. Even the shifting of light across stone could bring something into alignment with her gaze. And when it did, there was no pause, no moment where the world hesitated, only stillness. Complete, immediate, final. The land around her began to reflect this nature. Stone did not gather randomly. It formed a quiet record. Each figure held a moment that could not continue, a gesture interrupted, a step that would never complete itself, a face that would never change its expression. They did not decay. They did not return to the earth. They remained. And in remaining, they began to define the space itself. This was no longer simply the edge of the world. It was a place where movement ended, not violently, but absolutely. Medusa moved within it, but she did not belong to it in the same way as the stone did. She remained living, though that word had begun to lose its meaning around her. Life as it existed elsewhere required interaction, response, exchange. Here there was none. Her sisters remained near. Steno and Euryale did not share her curse. They did not turn what they saw into stillness. They did not carry the same consequence in their presence, and yet they did not leave. Not because they chose to stay, but because they had always existed within this distance. They did not question her. They did not react to what she had become. Their existence did not shift to accommodate her. But neither did it withdraw. This was the closest thing to continuity she had. Not connection, not understanding, but proximity that did not change. Still, even this did not soften the nature of what she carried, because her curse did not require others to act upon it. It required only that she exist. This is what made it complete. There was no condition under which it could be set aside, no moment of reprieve, no boundary that could contain it. Even in darkness, even with her gaze lowered, it remained present, waiting not as intention, but as inevitability. It was not something that followed her, it was something that was her. And yet, within this, there was something else, something quieter, more difficult to name. The curse did not only affect the world around her, it altered her relationship to it. She no longer looked freely. Sight became something measured, restricted, avoided. To see was to risk. To meet the world fully was to end it. And so, she learned not to. Not through instruction. Through consequence. Her existence narrowed, not in space, but in experience. The world remained vast, but she could no longer engage with it in the way she once had. She could not meet another gaze. She could not allow herself to be seen in return. Because what passed through her eyes did not come back unchanged. And in that absence, something settled. Not despair, not acceptance, but distance. A quiet separation between herself and everything that could no longer exist alongside her. The curse did not rage. It did not remind her of itself. It simply remained. Unbroken. Unquestioned. Complete. And in its completeness, it left no space for anything else to grow. It was not the absence of others that defined her loneliness. There were presences around her, forms that endured, shapes that remained. Her sisters stood within the same space, unchanged by the passage of time, unmoved by the quiet accumulation of stillness that surrounded them. Steno and Uriel did not withdraw. They did not turn away from her as the rest of the world had. And yet, they did not reach toward her either. Their existence was complete within itself. It did not expand to include her, nor did it contract in response to what she had become. They remained as they were, fixed, enduring, untouched by the kind of transformation that had reshaped her entirely. Medusa stood near them, but not within them. This is a different kind of distance, not measured by space, but by experience. They did not share what she carried. They did not move through the same altered relationship with the world. Their forms, though monstrous in the eyes of those who would later name them, were stable. They did not fracture what they looked upon. They did not turn presence into absence. They existed. She altered. And in that difference, something quiet formed. Not rejection. Not isolation imposed from outside, but separation that could not be bridged. She could stand beside them, but she could not meet them. Not fully. Not without risk. Even the possibility remained, unspoken, untested, but present, that her gaze, if lifted without care, could turn even them into something still and unchanging, and so she did not look. Not directly. Not completely. Her sisters did not require her gaze, but neither did they offer anything in return. Their presence was constant, but it did not engage, and constancy without connection does not soften loneliness. It deepens it. The land around them held its own quiet company. Stone figures scattered without pattern, without purpose beyond their permanence. They did not move, did not change, did not respond. They remained as a kind of presence, but one that could not answer. Medusa moved among them. Carefully, deliberately. Her gaze lowered, her awareness narrowed, as though even her own movement needed to be contained. The world around her had become something she could not fully participate in. It existed, but she could no longer enter it without consequence. This is what her curse extended into. Not just what she did, but what she could no longer do. She could not walk freely. She could not look openly. She could not allow herself to exist without calculation. Even stillness required awareness, because stillness did not remove the possibility of harm, it only delayed it. There were moments, rare, quiet, when nothing crossed her path, when the land remained empty, when no movement approached, when even the wind seemed to pass without touching her. In those moments, something almost resembling peace would settle, not warmth, not comfort, but absence of consequence. And within that absence, something else became more visible, the memory of what had once been. Not in detail, not in clear recollection, but in contrast, a sense of something lost, not through forgetting, but through distance. The life she had once moved through did not return to her as images or sounds. It remained as a quiet understanding that something had once existed that no longer could. And that understanding did not fade. It remained, just as everything else in this place remained, unchanged, unresolved. Her sisters did not carry this. They had never been something else. They had not moved from one state into another. They had always been as they were. And because of that, they did not look back. They did not measure the present against what had been lost. They simply existed. Medusa could not. Her existence held her before, and because it held her before, it carried absence. This is what separated her most. Not her form, not her power, but her awareness of change. The world beyond the edge continued, unseen by her, yet still present. Life moved, shifted, continued its patterns far from where she stood. The gods remained within their domains, unchanged in nature, untouched by what had unfolded. Nothing returned for her, nothing reached back, and in that absence, something settled into permanence. Loneliness, not as a feeling that rises and falls, but as a condition, a state of being that does not require emotion to exist. It simply is. She was not alone. And yet, there was no one with her. It was never given to her as a gift. There was no moment where it revealed itself as something she could claim, no quiet understanding that what she carried might be turned, shaped, or used. It did not arrive with meaning, only consequence. And yet, over time, something within it began to shift. Not the nature of the gaze itself, it remained unchanged, absolute, unyielding, but her relationship to it, what had first existed only as burden, as something to be avoided, to be endured, slowly began to take on another quality. Not control, but awareness. She could not stop what her eyes did, but she could begin to understand where it extended. At first, this understanding came through accident, a step taken too quickly, a glance lifted without intention, a presence crossing into her sight without warning. Each moment ended the same way, stillness, immediate and complete, but within that repetition, something began to form. A pattern, not in the outcome, in the boundary. Her gaze did not spread outward endlessly, it did not move beyond what she saw, it did not linger once removed, it acted within a line, a direction, a focus. And within that focus, there was something that resembled limitation. Not weakness, but containment. She began to move differently, not only to avoid harm, but to understand its reach. Her head turned more slowly. Her posture shifted, angled not toward openness, but toward control of what lay before her. She learned the shape of her own presence, not as it felt to her, but as it affected the world. This was not mastery, it was adaptation. The land responded accordingly. Where once stone figures had formed without pattern, now their placement began to carry something closer to intention. Not deliberate arrangement, not design, but the result of movement that had become more measured. She no longer walked blindly through consequence. She moved around it. And in doing so, something quiet began to emerge. The gaze was no longer only something that isolated her, it defined her. The world had already withdrawn from her presence. Life no longer crossed her path as it once had. The creatures that remained at the edges of this place, those that had not yet been caught in her sight, moved differently, as though guided by something unseen, something that warned them without sound. They kept their distance, and in that distance something formed. A boundary, not one she had chosen, but one that held. Nothing entered without risk, nothing approached without consequence. The space around her became a kind of stillness that did not belong to absence alone, but to protection. Not protection for her, protection from her. And yet within that there was something else. For the first time since her transformation, nothing threatened to reach her, no wandering presence crossed into her path unknowingly. No movement disrupted the fragile stillness she existed within. The world, which had once pressed upon her without restraint, now held its distance, and in that distance she remained untouched. This is how power reveals itself, not as something used, but as something that changes how the world moves around you. She did not seek it, but she existed within its effect. Her sisters remained as they always had, unchanged, unresponsive to this shift. They did not rely on her gaze, nor did they resist it. Their presence did not move closer, nor did it move away. But even here, something subtle had changed. They no longer stood entirely within the same space as before, not physically, but in relation. There was now a quiet recognition, not spoken, not acknowledged, but present, that Medusa carried something distinct. something that altered the ground between them, even if it did not yet act upon it. Distance, once undefined, had become structured, and structure, even in isolation, begins to resemble order. The gaze, once only a force of ending, had become something else. A boundary, a line that could not be crossed, a presence that reshaped the space around her without needing to move beyond it. But this did not soften its nature. It did not become less final. Anything that entered its path still met the same outcome: stillness, unbroken, irreversible. Power, in this form, does not evolve into something gentler. It remains what it is. It simply becomes understood. And understanding, even without control, changes how something is lived with. Medusa did not become less isolated. She did not become less removed from the world. But within that removal, she no longer existed only as something acted upon. She existed as something that acted. Not by will, but by presence. And presence, when it carries consequence, becomes something the world must respond to, even if that response is only distance. Even if that distance is silence. Even if that silence becomes everything. They did not arrive as a crowd. At first it was only one, a figure moving at the edge of the land, where the world still held enough structure to guide a path, but not enough to guarantee safety. He did not know exactly where he was going. Few ever did. The edges of the world are not marked by signs or boundaries that can be read. They are reached by those who continue walking when others turn back. He had heard something. Not a story in full, not a truth clearly spoken, but fragments. A place where stone held the shape of men. A presence that ended movement without struggle. A being whose existence marked a boundary between what could be faced and what should not be approached. This is how such journeys begin, not with certainty, but with curiosity sharpened by distance. He came alone, not because he was brave, but because no one else followed. The land changed beneath his steps, though he did not yet understand it. The air grew thinner in meaning, quieter in response. The signs that guide human movement, tracks, sound, shifting life, began to fade. But he continued, because turning back requires recognition, and recognition had not yet come. Medusa did not move to meet him. She did not seek those who approached. Her existence did not extend outward in search of contact. She remained where she was, within the quiet boundary her presence had formed. But the world carries movement inward, whether invited or not, and eventually he crossed into her space. The moment was not marked by sound. There was no warning, only a crossing. He saw the stone figures first. Their shapes arrested him, not with fear but with confusion. They stood too still, too precise. Each form held a moment that should have passed, but had not. He stepped closer, carefully, as though proximity might reveal what distance could not. This is the nature of trespass. It rarely feels like intrusion. It feels like approach. Medusa remained still, her gaze lowered, her awareness narrowed, but presence, once entered, does not withdraw on its own. He moved further in, and in that movement something aligned, not intentionally, not knowingly, but inevitably. A shift in angle, a lift of the head, a moment where sight and being crossed, and then stillness, immediate, complete. The figure did not fall, did not cry out, did not resist. He remained exactly where he had been in the moment before, but no longer within it. Stone. The land accepted him without change. Another shape added to what already remained. Medusa did not step closer, she did not look again, because she did not need to. The outcome had already settled. This was how it would continue. One became two. Two became more, not quickly, not in succession, but over time. Slow arrivals, uncertain steps, figures drawn not by knowledge, but by the quiet persistence of stories that travelled further than truth. Each came with something slightly different: curiosity, desire for proof, a need to see what others had not returned from. Some carried weapons, some carried nothing, but all carried the same assumption, that what lay ahead could be faced. The word monster had begun to form in the distant world, not yet fully defined, but gathering meaning, a thing to be confronted, a presence to be overcome, a shape that existed to test the limits of those who dared approach it. But Medusa did not exist as a test. She did not challenge, she did not provoke, she remained. And those who entered her space did so by their own continuation. Each arrival ended the same way. Not through struggle, not through contest, but through consequence. Stone did not argue. It did not resist. It simply replaced what had been. The land grew quieter with each figure that remained. Not emptier, but heavier, filled with the permanence of moments that could not move forward. Her sisters did not interfere. They did not guide or warn those who came. Their presence remained separate from the unfolding pattern, as though it did not concern them, and perhaps it did not. Because this was not their nature, it was hers. Medusa did not count those who came, she did not mark their passing. But something within the space began to shift, not in sound, not in movement, but in density. The world around her had become something else, not just a place of exile, but a place of ending, and beyond it, far from where she stood, the idea of her continued to grow, not as truth, but as story, a name that would begin to travel, a presence that would be spoken of without being understood. And with each telling, something changed. Because stories do not carry silence well. They fill it, they shape it, they turn what remains still into something that must be faced, and somewhere, beyond the edge of the world, someone would listen, not with hesitation, but with intent. Far from the edge of the world, where stillness had taken form in stone and silence no longer moved, life continued in quieter patterns. Cities rose where the land allowed. Walls were built, not to keep danger out, but to define what already belonged within. Voices passed through open spaces, shaping meaning into sound before dissolving into memory. Names were spoken, repeated, and slowly settled into something that endured. Here, the world felt contained, ordered, distant from the places where form broke and consequence remained without explanation. And within this contained world, a life began. Perseus. He did not arrive marked by anything visible. There were no signs that separated him from others at his beginning, no shift in the sky, no tremor beneath the ground, no quiet indication that his life would extend beyond the ordinary. He entered the world as all mortals do. Through time, through fragility, through a structure that does not protect what it creates. And yet, his origin did not belong entirely to what surrounded him. The gods do not remain distant. They do not stay confined to abstraction. At times their presence moves closer, not with care, not with intention, but simply because their nature does not allow separation. Zeus had once reshaped the order of everything, but even after that, his presence did not withdraw completely. It continued, it intersected, and where it touched mortal life, something else emerged. Perseus was born within that intersection, not chosen, not guided, but formed where divine force and human existence had briefly overlapped. This did not grant him safety. It did not set him apart in a way the world could recognize. If anything, it placed him within something heavier, something that would not reveal itself immediately, but would not remain absent. Because attention, once given, lingers. He grew without awareness of this. His life unfolded in quiet continuity, shaped by time and by experience. There were no early signs that pointed toward what he would become, No moment that separated him from others. Only movement, only change, only the gradual shaping of existence. But the world around him was not still. Stories moved through it. Not as complete truths, but as fragments carried across distance, altered each time they were told. They spoke of something far away, a place where movement ended, where forms remained fixed in their final moment, where a presence existed that could not be faced. These stories did not belong to him, they passed through him, but in passing, they remained. Where others heard warning, something within him did not turn away. The distance they described did not create avoidance. It created direction, not clearly, not consciously, but as a quiet alignment between what he was and what those stories carried. This is how the idea of a hero begins, not through decision, but through movement towards something others do not approach. Perseus did not seek Medusa. Not yet. He remained within the world he knew, moving through its patterns without disruption. But beneath that continuity, something had already begun to shift. Not outwardly, but within the structure that held him. Because beyond his awareness, something else was forming. A king, removed from the edge of the world, yet shaped by the same quiet nature of power. His desires did not require justification. They required only fulfillment. And in the shaping of those desires, Perseus became part of something larger than himself. Not through action, but through placement. This is how paths begin, not as journeys chosen, but as directions imposed. A task would come, not as opportunity, but as narrowing. A closing of all other possibilities until only one remained. And within that narrowing, movement begins. The path of a hero does not start with strength, it starts with constraint, with the quiet closing of the world behind until only one direction remains open. Perseus stood at that threshold, unaware, unformed, but already within it. The world around him continued as it always had, unmoved, unconcerned, carrying itself forward without pause. But beneath that continuation, something had shifted. A line had been drawn, invisible, unspoken, but certain, at one end, Medusa, unmoving, unchanged, existing where the world no longer reached. At the other, a life still unfolding, still capable of movement, still untouched by what it would soon encounter. And between them, distance. But distance in such a world is not empty. It is time. And time does not prevent what has begun. It carries it forward, quietly, until what moves toward itself arrives. Power among mortals does not arrive as inevitability. It must be maintained. Held in place through quiet decisions, through the shaping of others, through the careful removal of anything that unsettles its position. A king does not need to be stronger than all who stand before him. He only needs to remain unchallenged. This was the condition within which Polydectes ruled. His authority was not vast, not divine, not beyond reach, but it was stable. It rested upon a structure that did not question him, a world small enough to be managed, yet large enough to conceal intention. And within that world, there was something he desired. Not conquest, not expansion, but possession. Dana. She existed within his reach, yet not within his control. And that distinction, though subtle, was enough to create tension. Desire, when unfulfilled, does not remain still. It begins to move outward, searching for a way to complete itself. But there was something in its path. Perseus, not as an opponent, not as a rival, but as presence. A son who stood near enough to disrupt what the king wished to claim. He did not oppose Polydectes directly. He did not threaten his authority through action. But he existed. And sometimes existence is enough. Because power does not wait for conflict to become visible. It moves to prevent it. Polydectes did not confront him openly. He did not remove him through force. He chose something quieter, something that did not appear as cruelty, but carried it completely, a demand, framed as expectation, spoken as though it belonged within the natural order of things. There was to be a gift, a gathering, an offering of loyalty, of tribute, each man bringing something worthy of the king, horses, wealth, tokens that could be seen and measured. And Perseus, standing among them, had nothing to offer. This absence became the opening. Polydectes did not accuse him. He did not humiliate him. He allowed the silence to settle, long enough for it to define him. And then he spoke, not with anger, not with force, but with suggestion. If Perseus had nothing to give, then he could offer something greater, something rare, something worthy of being remembered, the head of Medusa. The words did not carry weight in the moment they were spoken. They settled lightly, as though they belonged within the same space as any other request. But beneath them, there was no path of return, because this was not a task, it was removal. To refuse would be to step outside the structure that held him in place, to expose himself and his mother to the will of a king who no longer needed to disguise intention. To accept was to move toward something that did not allow survival. The choice existed only in appearance. And Perseus understood this, not fully, not in the depth that would later unfold, but enough to know that standing still was no longer possible. So he spoke. He accepted, not as declaration, but as continuation. Because once placed within such a movement, there is no space left to remain where one is. The court did not react. There was no outcry, no recognition of what had been set into motion. The world of men does not always acknowledge its own cruelty, especially when it is shaped carefully enough to resemble order. The moment passed, but its consequence did not. Perseus stood within it, already separate from where he had been, already moving, though he had not yet taken a step. Polydectes did not watch him closely after that. He did not need to. The outcome had already been determined, not by certainty of death, but by the absence of any path that led elsewhere. This is how such power works. It does not strike, it arranges. And once arranged, it allows the world to complete what has been set into motion. Perseus did not leave immediately, but departure had already begun. The space around him no longer held the same meaning. What had once been familiar now felt distant, as though he had already stepped outside it, even while standing within it. Dana remained behind, unmoved, but not untouched. Because absence, once created, does not remain contained. It extends. The edge of the world waited, not as destination, but as inevitability. Medusa remained there, unchanged, unaware, unreached by the words that had just shaped the path toward her. She did not know that her existence had been drawn into something beyond itself, that her name had become an instrument, that her stillness would soon be met by movement. But the world does not require awareness to bring things together. It requires only continuation. And now, that continuation had begun. He did not seek them. Perseus did not climb toward the heavens, nor did he call out for guidance. His movement had already begun, not as a journey shaped by purpose, but as a path imposed upon him. The world had shifted beneath his feet, and he followed where it led. And yet, the gods noticed, not all at once, not as a gathering of attention, but as a quiet alignment. There are moments when a life moves into proximity with something larger than itself, not through merit, not through virtue, but through position. Perseus had entered such a moment. His path, though chosen under pressure, now intersected with something that carried weight beyond human scale. And where such intersections occur, the gods respond, not always with intention, but never without consequence. The first presence came without form, a subtle shift in the air, a quiet awareness that something unseen had entered the space around him. It did not press upon him, it did not overwhelm, it simply existed, close enough to alter the way the world felt. Athena. Her presence did not arrive as protection, it arrived as precision. She did not step before him as a figure to be followed, nor did she offer reassurance. Her nature did not bend toward comfort. She did not see Perseus as something to be saved, she saw him as something that could be aligned. The task before him did not interest her because of its danger, it interested her because of its structure. Medusa was no longer part of order. She existed outside it, at the edge, where form had loosened and consequence had settled into stillness. Athena did not move to undo what had been done, but she could define how it would end, and Perseus, placed upon this path, became part of that definition. Her guidance was not spoken, it revealed itself through clarity. A direction that did not explain itself, but felt certain. A narrowing of possibility, where movement became more precise, more deliberate. He did not question it, because in the presence of such clarity, questions do not remain. Then came Hermes. Where Athena refined, Hermes moved. His presence did not settle into stillness. It passed through, quick and shifting, touching the edges of perception without remaining in one place. He did not carry the weight of structure, he carried motion, and in motion there is passage. He did not stand before Perseus as a teacher. He did not instruct him in what must be done, but he brought with him something necessary, a blade, not ornate, not marked by ceremony, but exact. Its edge held a kind of quiet certainty, not because it was powerful, but because it would not fail in the moment it was needed. It did not promise victory, it removed hesitation. Perseus received it without fully understanding what it would require of him, because tools, like paths, do not explain themselves. They wait, and then they act. From Athena came something else, a shield. Its surface was not meant to strike, it was meant to reflect, polished, smooth, without distortion. It did not alter what it showed, it revealed it, indirectly. This was not a gift of strength, it was a gift of distance, to see without meeting, to perceive without being consumed by what was perceived. Medusa's gaze could not be faced. But it could be avoided, not through blindness, but through reflection. This was the shape of Athena's intervention, not protection, but redirection. Other presences followed, not always visible, not always named, sandals that did not bind the feet to the ground, but allowed them to move beyond it, a helm that did not erase the one who wore it, but removed him from the sight of others. Each object carried the same quality. Not power in excess, but precision. They did not make Perseus greater than he was. They made him capable of surviving what he had already been set against. The gods did not gather around him. They did not walk beside him. They did not remain. Their presence passed through him, leaving behind what was needed, and then withdrawing. Because their role was not to accompany, it was to shape, and once shaped, to release. Perseus stood alone again, but not as he had been before. The path ahead had not changed. It still led toward the edge of the world, toward a presence that did not yield, toward a stillness that could not be faced directly. But now, he carried something within that movement, not certainty, not safety, but alignment. The world had adjusted around him, subtly, irreversibly, and far ahead, Medusa remained, unmoving, unaware, her gaze unchanged. Her existence settled into the same quiet permanence. She did not know that something now moved toward her with the means to see without being seen, to approach without meeting her gaze, to end what had never been challenged. The distance between them had not shortened, but it had changed. Because now, it was no longer empty. He did not know where it was. The edge of the world is not marked by roads, nor guided by signs that lead directly toward it. It is not a place that can be found through knowledge alone. It exists beyond certainty, beyond maps, beyond the boundaries that hold meaning for those who remain within them. And yet, Perseus moved toward it, not because he understood the path, but because the path had already begun to shape itself around him. The world, once familiar, began to loosen. At first it was subtle. The ground still held form, the sky still stretched above him in its usual distance, the rhythm of his steps remained unchanged. But something beneath this familiarity had shifted. The sense of direction, once anchored by known places, began to dissolve. He walked forward, and forward did not feel the same. The land grew quieter. Not empty, but less responsive. The signs that guide movement, tracks, echoes, the presence of life, began to thin. It was not that the world had ended, it was that it had begun to withdraw. This is how forbidden places are reached, not by crossing into them, but by leaving everything else behind. The objects he carried remained with him, though he did not yet fully understand them. The sandals lifted him from the ground, not in flight, but in lightness. Each step touched less, pressed less, as though the world beneath him was no longer entirely necessary. He did not rise above it. But he was no longer bound to it in the same way. The helm rested with quiet weight. It did not change his form, but it altered how presence moved around him. When worn, he became something less visible, not absent, but unregistered. The world did not react to him as it once had. He moved through it, without being met. And the shield remained close. Its surface held clarity that did not belong to ordinary reflection. It did not distort, did not shift with light. It showed exactly what stood before it, but at a distance, as though separating sight from consequence. He did not use it yet, but its purpose lingered, waiting. The journey stretched without measure. Time did not pass in a way that could be counted. Days did not settle into memory. The world did not provide markers that allowed him to understand how far he had come, or how far remained. Only movement, continuous, unbroken, and then something changed, not suddenly, but undeniably. The land no longer felt as though it belonged to the world he had left. The air grew still in a different way, not calm, not peaceful, but settled, as though it had already reached its final state and had no need to shift further. The ground held shapes that did not move. At first, they seemed like natural formations, stone rising from the earth, worn by time into uneven figures. But as he drew closer, something within them resisted that explanation. They were too precise, too deliberate. Each held a form that suggested something interrupted, a movement stopped, a moment that had not completed itself. He slowed, not out of fear, but out of recognition. This was not a place shaped by time alone. It was shaped by something else, something that did not allow continuation. The space around him grew heavier, not in weight, but in meaning. The silence here was not empty. It was filled with what had ended. Perseus did not step forward blindly. For the first time since his journey had begun, he adjusted. The shield rose. Not fully, not as defence, but as distance. He did not look directly at what lay ahead. He allowed the surface to show him what he could not face. The world shifted through reflection. Forms appeared without meeting his gaze. Shapes moved within the boundary of the shield, separate from him, untouched by his direct sight. This was how he entered, not by crossing into danger, but by stepping around it. The boundary did not stop him, but it changed how he moved within it. Each step became deliberate, each motion measured. The land no longer allowed instinct, it required precision, and somewhere within it, she remained, unseen, unmoving, not hidden, but unreachable by ordinary sight. The journey had not ended, it had narrowed. The space between movement and stillness had become thin, and Perseus now stood within it, not yet at the centre. But no longer outside it. The world behind him had faded, the world ahead of him had already begun to close, and between them, only this, a place where movement slowed, where presence settled, where what continued would not return unchanged. She was not waiting. There was no awareness in her stillness that something approached, no anticipation, no quiet recognition that the path of another life had begun to converge with her own. Medusa did not hold expectation. She remained, as she always had. The land around her carried its usual silence, not empty, not hollow, but filled with what had already ended. Stone figures stood in their scattered permanence, each one holding a moment that would never move forward. Nothing shifted, nothing disturbed the stillness, and within it, she rested. Sleep, for her, was not the same as it had once been. It did not come as release, nor as comfort. It was not a retreat from the world, because the world had already withdrawn from her. It was something quieter, a lowering, a soft dimming of awareness that did not fully disappear. Even in sleep, she remained what she was. The serpents that had replaced her hair did not rest completely. They moved faintly, as though carrying a life that did not depend on her own. Their motion was slow, almost imperceptible, but constant. A reminder that stillness for her was never absolute. Her body lay upon the ground, neither guarded nor hidden. There were no defences placed around her, no attempt to conceal her presence from what might come. She did not protect herself, because nothing had ever needed to be defended. Everything that had entered her space had already met its end, and so she remained exposed, not vulnerable, but unchallenged. Perseus saw her before he understood what he was seeing. Through the shield, her form appeared not as something immediate, but as something distant, translated through reflection. The surface did not distort her, but it removed her from direct sight, placing her just beyond reach. He did not lower the shield, not even slightly, because by now he understood that seeing her directly was not something that could be undone. He moved slowly, each step placed with care, as though the ground itself required permission to be crossed. The stone figures around him did not shift, but their presence pressed inward, forming a silent boundary that narrowed his movement. They did not warn him, they did not guide him, but they remained, as evidence, of what had already happened. Medusa lay among them, not at the centre, not elevated, simply present. Her form, even through reflection, held something that resisted easy understanding. She did not appear as something chaotic, nor as something wild. There was no frenzy in her stillness, no disorder in the way she existed. She was composed, almost quiet, as though what she had become had settled into itself completely. The serpents moved. Slowly, their bodies coiling and uncoiling in a rhythm that did not disturb the rest of her. They did not strike, they did not search. They simply lived, separate yet bound, part of her and yet not entirely controlled by her. Perseus did not linger. He did not allow the moment to expand beyond what it required. Because hesitation, here, did not create safety. It only extended exposure. The blade remained at his side, unmoving, waiting. It had not yet been used, but its purpose had already been decided. He adjusted his position, not to face her, but to align with the reflection. Every movement he made was guided by what the shield revealed, not by what stood before him. He did not trust his own sight, he trusted the distance it provided. This was the only way to approach something that could not be met directly. Medusa did not wake. There was no shift in her form, no sign that she sensed what had entered her space. Her sleep held, unbroken, unaware. And within that unawareness, something fragile existed, not weakness, not defenselessness, but a moment where what she was did not act. The gaze that had ended so many lives remained closed, contained, absent from the world for the first time since it had been formed. Perseus stood within that absence, closer now, closer than any had come without being seen. The distance between them had narrowed to almost nothing, and yet he had not faced her, he had not met her, he had not entered the space that had ended all others. He remained outside it, just enough. The world did not move, the air did not shift, everything held, as though waiting, not for struggle, but for completion. He did not look at her, not once. Even now, standing closer than any who had come before him, Perseus did not allow his eyes to meet what lay before him directly. The shield remained raised, not as defence, but as distance. Everything he saw came through reflection, reversed, softened, separated. This was not sight as it had once been. It was something more deliberate, more fragile. The world reached him indirectly, filtered through a surface that allowed perception without consequence. And within that surface, Medusa existed, not as a force, not as a threat, but as an image. Still, unaware. Her form lay quiet against the ground, her serpents moving with that same slow, continuous life. In reflection, they seemed almost distant, their motion reduced to something less immediate, less dangerous. But the danger had not changed, only the way it was approached. Perseus adjusted his breath, not because he feared what he saw, but because the moment required precision. There was no space here for instinct, no room for reaction. Everything had to be placed exactly where it belonged. Even movement. The blade rested in his hand now. It did not tremble, it did not shift. It remained as it had always been, sharp, exact, waiting for the moment when it would become part of what was already unfolding. He did not raise it yet, not immediately, because even this required alignment. His body turned slightly, positioning itself not toward her, but toward the reflection of her. His steps were small, almost imperceptible, closing the final distance without ever breaking the fragile boundary that allowed him to remain unseen. He did not rush. There was no urgency in his movement, because urgency leads to error. An error, here, did not allow recovery. The world around him remained unchanged. The stone figures stood silent. The air did not stir. Nothing acknowledged what was about to happen. This was not a battle. It was not a confrontation. It was a moment. Singular. Unrepeatable. Perseus lifted the blade. Slowly. Not as a strike, but as a continuation of the movement he had already begun. The reflection held steady. Medusa remained as she was, unaware, unmoving, existing within a stillness that had never been broken by force, only by consequence. And now that consequence had arrived again, but from the opposite direction. He did not see her eyes. He did not need to. He saw only what the shield allowed, and within that boundary, he acted. The blade moved, not violently, not with force, but with precision, a single motion, clean, final. There was no resistance, no struggle, no sound that marked the end of what had been. The moment did not expand. It did not echo. It simply occurred. And then it was over. Medusa did not rise, did not react, did not become something else in the final instant. She remained as she had been, and then she was no longer whole. The serpent stilled, not completely, but differently. Their motion lost its rhythm, as though something central had been removed from them. The space around her did not change. The land did not shift in response. The world did not acknowledge what had just taken place, because the world does not pause for endings. It absorbs them. Perseus did not look down. He did not lower the shield. He did not allow himself to see what lay before him without the distance he had maintained from the beginning. Even now, especially now, he remained within reflection. The head was taken, carefully, not as a trophy, not as proof, but as something that still carried consequence, because the gaze had not ended, it had only been separated, and separation in such a world does not remove power, it relocates it. The blade lowered, the moment passed, and yet something remained. Not in sound, not in movement, but in absence. A stillness that was different from before, not the stillness of presence, but of something that had been removed completely. The land held it, the air carried it, the silence deepened, not in weight, but in meaning. Perseus stepped back, slowly, without turning, without breaking the fragile alignment that had allowed him to reach this point without being seen. He did not remain, because nothing required him to. The act had already completed itself, and what followed was not continuation, but departure. Behind him, Medusa no longer remained as she had been. Before him, the path opened again, not as it had before, but as something altered, because what had stood at the edge of the world no longer stood there, and what had been taken had not ended. It had only begun to move. It had already happened. The motion had been made, the blade had passed, the separation had taken place with a precision that left no space for reversal. There was no struggle to recall, no clash to remember. The act itself had not lingered long enough to become something dramatic, and yet this was the moment that would remain, not the strike, but what followed. Perseus did not lower the shield. Even now, even after the blade had done what it was meant to do, he did not allow his eyes to meet what lay before him. The reflection still held the world at a distance, still preserved the fragile boundary between sight and consequence. Because the danger had not ended, it had only changed form. The head rested apart now, separated, but not emptied. The serpent still moved, though their rhythm had altered. Their motion was no longer anchored in the same quiet continuity. It had become restless, uneven, as though something central had been removed, yet not entirely erased. The eyes, though unseen, remained, and within them the same stillness waited, unbroken. Perseus moved carefully. There was no release in his movement, no sudden easing of tension. If anything, the space around him felt more uncertain than before. What had once been fixed, contained within a single presence, was now divided. And division, in such a world, does not weaken power. It multiplies its reach. He reached for the head without looking. The shield angled downward, guiding his awareness without exposing him to what could not be faced directly. His hands moved with deliberation, not from fear, but from understanding. This was not an object, it was a continuation. He placed it within the pouch he carried, not hidden, but contained. A space that did not neutralize its power, but limited its direction. Even covered, even removed from sight, it remained what it had always been, a force that did not require its body to act. This was the final understanding, that what had been ended had not truly ended. The body remained where it lay, still, unmoving. For the first time since its transformation, it no longer carried the same presence. The weight of it had shifted. Something essential had been taken away, leaving behind a form that no longer held the same consequence. And yet, it did not return to what it had been. There is no return in such stories, only change. The land responded in silence. No tremor passed through it. No wind rose to mark what had occurred. The stone figures remained where they stood, unchanged, unaffected by the act that had removed the source of their stillness, because what had created them still existed. Now carried elsewhere. Steno and Euryale did not appear immediately, but their presence had not been absent. They had always existed within this space, just beyond the immediate reach of what Perseus had done. And now, something within that space had shifted in a way that could not go unnoticed, not through sight, but through absence. A change in the shape of what remained. Perseus did not wait. He did not remain to witness what would follow. Because this was not a place that allowed pause. Not anymore. The moment had completed itself, and completion, in such a world, does not invite reflection. It demands departure. He stepped back, carefully, maintaining the same distance, the same alignment, the same refusal to meet directly what could still end him if faced without precaution. Each movement carried him further from the centre of what had occurred. But the distance did not feel like escape, because what he carried remained with him. The edge of the world began to loosen behind him, not immediately, not in a way that could be clearly marked, but the density of stillness began to thin. The land no longer held the same concentrated weight. The silence, though still present, began to spread outward, losing the sharpness it had once contained. Something had been removed. But not erased. Perseus did not turn back. He did not look. Because looking back, even now, carried risk, and because there was nothing behind him that could be returned to. The act was complete. But its consequence had only begun to move. Far from this place, beyond the fading edge where stone no longer marked the ground, the world continued as it always had, unaware, unchanged, waiting for what would be brought back to it, not as victory, not as proof, but as something far more dangerous. A presence no longer fixed to one place, a force no longer bound to one body. The beheading had not ended Medusa, it had freed her. It did not end in stillness. Though her body lay quiet, though the blade had completed its motion without resistance, something within Medusa had not settled into absence. The land, which had held so many endings, did not receive this one in the same way. Because this was not an ending alone. It was a release. From the place where her body remained, something began to emerge, not slowly, not hesitantly, but with a certainty that did not belong to life as it had been known before. There was no pause between death and what followed, only transition. The ground did not open. The sky did not darken. And yet, something rose. From the blood that touched the earth, movement began again. Not the movement of what had been, not a return of the form that had been lost, but something new. Something that had not existed until this moment. The first to emerge did not belong to the land. It did not crawl, did not struggle, did not search for stability. It rose upward, as though the ground itself could not contain it. Wings unfolded, not slowly, not uncertainly, but completely formed, carrying a shape that had never been bound to stillness. Pegasus. It did not look back. It did not pause to understand where it had come from. It moved, upward, away from the place of its origin, into a sky that had never held it before. There was no hesitation in its flight, no moment where it faltered or turned, because it had not been born into the patterns that require learning. It had emerged complete. And so it continued without question. The air accepted it. The space above the land once untouched by such a presence, now carried something that did not belong to the ground. The stillness below remained unchanged, but above it something moved freely, unbound. And then something else followed, not upward, but forward, Chrysar. Where Pegasus had risen into distance, this form remained closer to the earth. It did not take flight, but it carried its own presence, distinct, separate, no less complete. It emerged without uncertainty, without fragmentation, as though it had always existed, waiting only for this moment to take shape. Neither struggled, neither resisted. They did not carry the confusion of birth, they carried its certainty. This is what made them different. They were not continuations of Medusa. They were not fragments of what she had been. They were consequences, formed not in life, but through death. And in that formation, something quiet revealed itself, that even in a world defined by endings, creation does not cease. It shifts. It emerges from places where it is not expected, from moments that do not seem to hold anything beyond conclusion. The land did not change in response. The stone figures remained, the silence held. Medusa's body lay where it had fallen, no longer carrying the presence that had once defined it. And yet, from that same place, something had entered the world that could not have existed before. Perseus did not remain to witness all of this. He had already begun to move away, carrying with him what had been taken, unaware that what had been left behind was not empty, because not all consequences travel in the same direction. Some remain, some rise, some move beyond reach entirely. Pegasus was already distant, a shape against the sky that grew smaller, not because it weakened, but because it refused to remain within the boundaries of the place that had given it form. Chrysar remained closer, but even here, closeness did not mean attachment. Neither turned back, neither returned. The connection between them and what had created them did not bind them. It released them. This is the quiet contradiction of such moments, that from something defined by isolation, by stillness, by a presence that ended movement, something capable of endless movement could emerge, not as correction, not as balance, but as continuation. The world did not acknowledge this. It did not reshape itself around what had appeared, because the world does not pause to recognize what it produces. It continues, and what it produces must find its place within that continuation. Medusa remained behind, not as she had been, not as she had become, but as something that had already passed beyond its own meaning. And yet, what had come from her did not carry that stillness. It carried motion. It carried distance. It carried the quiet proof that even at the edge of the world, where everything seemed to end, something could still begin. It did not lose its power. Separation had not silenced it. What Perseus carried was no longer part of a living body, no longer bound to movement, no longer capable of turning its gaze by its own will, and yet it remained unchanged in what it could do. The eyes did not close, the force within them did not fade. It waited, contained, but not diminished. He did not hold it openly. The pouch remained sealed, its surface drawn tight, not as concealment alone, but as necessity. What lay within was not something that could be carried without care. Even unseen, even covered, it shaped the space around it in ways that could not be entirely avoided. Presence does not require visibility, it only requires existence. Perseus moved away from the edge of the world. The land behind him loosened, its stillness dispersing as distance grew. The stone figures no longer gathered as they had before. The air regained its movement. The world, slowly, began to return to something more familiar. But he did not return unchanged. What he carried altered his movement. Each step held awareness, not of what lay ahead, but of what remained with him. The boundary he had once crossed into Medusa's domain had not disappeared. It had followed him, now contained within something he could not release. The first time it was used, it was not deliberate. A moment of misalignment. A shift. The pouch loosened, only slightly, but enough. A figure stood before him, not an enemy, not a presence shaped by threat, but simply a life that had crossed his path without knowing what it approached. There was no warning, no time. The gaze, even partially revealed, did not hesitate. And once again, stone. Immediate. Complete. Perseus did not pause. He did not look. He tightened the pouch, sealed it once more, and continued, because by now he understood. The act had not ended the danger. It had multiplied it. What had once been fixed in one place, avoidable through distance, was now mobile. It could be carried, directed, brought into spaces that had never known its presence before. The world had not prepared for this. It did not recognize what moved within it, and so it remained vulnerable. This is how power changes when it is removed from its origin. It becomes something else, not contained by place, but carried by intention. Perseus did not use it freely. He did not draw it out as a weapon in moments of ease, but when faced with what could not be overcome through movement alone, when something stood before him that could not be passed without consequence, he allowed it to be seen. Briefly, just enough, and each time the same result: stillness, final, unquestioned. There was no struggle in it, no resistance. Because resistance requires time, and time was not given. The head did not act differently from how it had before. It did not change in nature, but its presence in the world had shifted entirely. It no longer belonged to the edge. It moved through the centre. And wherever it moved, the boundary between life and stillness followed. Perseus returned to where he had begun, not as he had left. The king who had sent him did not expect his return. The demand had not been made with the intention of fulfillment. It had been made to remove. But now, what had been sent away had come back, and with it, something far more dangerous than absence. Polydectes stood where power had always placed him, unchallenged, unquestioned, certain, until that certainty was broken, not through force, not through conflict, but through revelation. Perseus did not argue, he did not confront, he did not raise a weapon in the way men do. He opened a pouch. Only for a moment, only enough, the gaze met the world once more. And power, which had once arranged events so carefully, so quietly, so completely, ended, not in collapse, not in struggle, but in stillness, stone. The court did not resist, it did not react. It followed. One by one. The same result. The same silence. The same permanence. Perseus closed the pouch again. The act was complete. But something had changed beyond what could be undone. The head had fulfilled its purpose. But it had not been emptied by it. It remained. Capable. Waiting. And in time, it would be placed elsewhere. Not hidden, not discarded, but given. Returned to the domain of the one who had shaped its beginning. Athena. She would not destroy it. She would not remove its power. She would carry it, place it upon her shield, not as decoration, but as reminder. That power once formed does not disappear. It changes hands, it changes form, but it remains. Medusa, though no longer present in body, did not vanish from the world. She became something else, not a figure at the edge of the world, but a presence carried within it, a gaze that did not fade, a consequence that did not end. And in that continuation, something quiet remained, not memory, not story, but something deeper, a stillness that could still be seen.